To say the least, things at Keystone Park lately have been a bit hectic. We were recently forced to downsize our veterinary team to ensure that zoos all around the world had adequate care for their animals. At Keystone Park, we value conservation and care for the animals over everything else, including profits. One thing passive-aggressive Keystone Park shareholders may not understand is that the care you put in towards your animals directly impacts your zoo's financial growth. Failed retention is the one thing that can absolutely cripple a starting business. Specifically, what I mean by this is that you're never going to make money off of a guest that only comes to your zoo once. Repeated customers equals profit margins, and if you don't care for your animals, nobody's going to come to your zoo again. As an owner, the easiest way to take care of animals is to hire somebody to do it for you. Zookeepers are absolutely the beating heart of any zoo, and every penny of profit that Keystone Park has accumulated can be traced back to them. Taking care of every single animal and effectively knowing that our entire business model is dependent on their success is bound to be a little bit stressful, no matter what they say, because they'll tell you no. Unfortunately, not every zoo around the world values animal care and conservation. As the saying goes, one bad apple truly can spoil the bunch, which is precisely why the relocation of our veterinary staff was a necessary move. Thankfully, despite our skeleton vet crew, all animals at Keystone Park appear to be in good health. This includes our newest animal too, our new wolf pup Reagan. Reagan is the pup of her father Kirby and her mother Phoebe. Kirby and Phoebe are definitely two of our favorites here. They were unfit for the wild and were thus brought to Keystone Park. That was about a year ago now, and I think it's safe to say they adjusted well. Being parents is a totally different story. Hopefully they're going to be able to teach baby Reagan everything that they've learned. So far, our veterinary staff has had nothing but positive things to say about Kirby and Phoebe's parenting. Let's check back in on them later. Due to most of our vet's time being taken up by the unexpected arrival of baby Reagan, another pregnancy was able to slip through the cracks. Classified as endangered by the IUCN, the discovery that one of our giant otters is expecting is an incredible win for conservation. Giant otter births in captivity are exceptionally rare. Matter of fact, in the United States, it hasn't happened since 2004. Obviously, we take all pregnancies and births here extremely seriously. However, due to the endangered nature of this species, the pressure's on. As sad as it is to say, giant otter in the wild are truly struggling, so we have to ensure this pregnancy goes as smooth as possible. As a start, we decided to first upgrade the quality of the food the giant otters are receiving. Admittedly, it is a little bit expensive to import fish straight from the Amazon. However, the sight of a happy and healthy otter is truly priceless, so it's worth it in the end. The rest of South America has been relatively quiet, as all the animals are still adjusting to their new habitats. So far, there's nothing at all negative to report. However, this may change once guests are actually introduced to South America once the brand new section of Keystone Park opens in the next episode. What's left of our veterinary staff has been doing frequent check-ins on the animals and monitoring their stress levels to ensure that they're going to be prepared mentally for the zoo's opening. The animals, as well as the staff, seem to have gotten into a healthy routine. In theory, adding about 500 guests to Keystone Park shouldn't change this. In practice, we truly have no idea. Being able to adapt to any situation is truly a trait of a successful business, and hopefully we can get there. In case you missed the last episode, we started construction on our very next indoor habitat. This was a difficult build. It took a lot of revisions and my delete button is almost worn down. Eventually, with enough perseverance and luck, we were able to bring out a product that looks exceptional. Taking heavy inspiration from both Aztec and Mayan temples from South America, the ultimate goal of this exhibit is to look like an ancient structure that has been overtaken by nature, providing an excellent home for the capuchin monkey. Our capuchin troop definitely has one of the more intricate enclosures at Keystone Park. They have a sizable indoor portion, as well as a very large exterior that has a ton of climbing structure. The capuchin proved to be just as curious as they are intelligent. Their enrichment items as a result were quite difficult to place and maintain. Primates of any species, but especially capuchin monkey, are incredibly dexterous, which effectively means they're really good at using their hands. Since they're so articulate, it was really hard to keep them entertained, since they can go pretty much everywhere in their habitat. We had to make sure we packed the entire habitat full of enrichment items that the capuchin would be sure to enjoy. By observing the capuchin for a couple of weeks, I would say that our plan was definitely a success. They've really made this temple their home. However, they're gonna have to share it with a different species. Let's get into that. If you guys enjoyed today's video and have been enjoying this series as a whole, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support really is what keeps me going, in terms of my own personal motivation as well as the YouTube algorithm. Putting it in simple terms, the more likes, comments, and subscriptions a video gets, the more people can see the video. The more people that see the video, the more videos I make. Thanks again for the support. Now let's read up on our animal. Meet the apex predator of the Amazon rainforest, as well as Keystone Park's very first big cat, the jaguar. Comparing it to species that live in the same location like the giant otter, I would have guessed that the jaguar's population in the wild would have been significantly lower. 64,000 is a sizable wild population. It looks like the Jaguar, which is a solitary animal, is going to need 668 square meters of land, 80 square meters of climbing, and 37 square meters of water. This makes it a relatively complicated animal. It doesn't necessarily require a deep dive either, but has the capability to do so. This is going to be a relatively intricate and complicated build. As I just mentioned, jaguars are solitary animals. Despite being an apex predator, they're surprisingly shy in relationship with humans. This means they're going to be prone to stress, so their exhibit is going to have a ton of foliage all around. Since this is our first big cat in Keystone Park, we're going to gain access to a few new enrichment items, mostly these scratching posts and scratching trees. Being one of the most dangerous species in the New World, of course they don't have any cohabitation. As I mentioned, I want this build to take inspiration from some ancient structures of South America. However, from the back you wouldn't be able to tell. I think in the last episode we captured the effect pretty perfectly. I like the stairs and I like the towers. These are two key aspects of Mayan temples. So we've established that we like the design on the front and we simply want to get it to the back. This is where the most important aspect of Planet Zoo comes in, besides animal knowledge, which is geometry. I thought a little bit ahead and made the capuchin's entrance to their indoor portion the exact same width as this window. Therefore, all we have to do is take the towers, duplicate them, and then move them to the back. Knowing very basic angles and planning your builds out ahead truly can save a ton of time. I often get asked how I build things like this so quickly, and it really is thinking ahead and planning. The difficult part of building is when things don't go to plan, and as I was raising the terrain, messing around with the height and variation, I realized that I built the path way too close to the terrain. Therefore, there is a little trench right next to the build that I couldn't get rid of without redoing the whole path. In the last episode, if you remember, that took literally hours, so I didn't want to redo that, so we had to get creative. Creativity takes time, so while I tried to think of a solution, I did the exact same duplication trick with this part. This part of the build only looks correct if it's rotated a certain way, so we had to use geometry again and rotate it 180 degrees. After it was rotated, it was about as simple as putting a piece into a puzzle. What's not going to be simple though is figuring out how to fix this trench. We can't use water, they'll swim over it, it has to be relatively tall so we can't build up. I really have no idea. Let's focus on a different aspect while we can think of ideas. I think one thing we can do to eliminate this trench is by pushing out the build in certain areas, specifically this window. We'll push it out to about the base of the stairs. Utilizing the advanced movement menu and using the Z-axis, we were able to get a geometrically perfect wall. If you're not sure how these axes work, it's really quite simple. If you're on the blue axis, which is the Z-axis, you can push it up and down in this direction, and it'll never veer to the left and the right. It'll only go perfectly straight along that arrow, so it's really good for making your builds precise. Naturally, after we pushed the wall back, there is now a hole in the floor. This is really easy to fix with the duplication features. Much better, but I still don't know what to do with this trench, and it's a lot bigger than I was previously thinking. Fortunately for us, after taking an aerial view of the build, I know exactly how we can start to fix it. Using the duplication feature one more time, I added in a bunch of the same towers all around the build, making it look more like a formidable structure. This broke the trench up into much more manageable pieces. Now we can easily close up the crevice of some rocks, being very careful to make sure they don't poke through. We're going to be using the exact same rockwork technique that we used in the anteater and capuchin habitats. The capuchin makes sense, it's literally in the front of this building, and the anteater's right across the road. In case you forgot how to do it, basically all we do is start with a fine layer of the tropical rock. I really like the color of these, they're dark but fit in of South America. After the tropical rocks are placed, we'll then come in with the mossy rocks and dynamic mossy rocks. There is a difference, but I won't explain it here. The goal of these rocks is to almost merge them together, forcing the patterns to create very unique shapes that you couldn't easily replicate. To add height and elevation, simply use larger rocks and do the exact same technique of the mossy. Just make sure it doesn't break through the build, because it can really take away from the immersion. Typically while building, I try to avoid clashing textures. However, these rocks have a very similar texture. The only thing that's different is the color, so they actually work really well when merged together. Now that the trench is gone, I want to stick with the theme of covering things up. I think the next thing we have to cover up is the roof of this entire enclosure. So far, only the capuchin's indoor portion is actually closed. Let's get to that. Before beginning a certain section of a build, typically I have a good idea in my head of whether it's going to be difficult or easy. This, however, was the exception. It's relatively square in some locations, but other has a fair bit of elevation. The elevation was definitely going to be the problem in this build, so the first step I took was getting rid of all of it. I thought this would take a lot longer than it actually did, but surprisingly it was pretty quick. We had to utilize a fair bit of advanced techniques to make everything perfect. We also had to get rid of this annoying glitch. After a little bit of hard work, we eventually got the elevation all set to the point where we could put on the actual roof of this place. I quickly realized this is going to be a lot more difficult than raising the elevation. There was a fair bit of overhang in places where I didn't necessarily want it. The overhang was child's play compared to implementing this skylight. I really liked the look of it over in the capuchin place, but something in the back of my mind told me I needed to expand on it. Two just didn't look natural here. I went through a variety of designs, including this, and eventually settled on this. It took a really long time to cover everything, and the corners, especially where it was rounded, were exceptionally difficult. If you look about in the center of the build though, I left a small space that's a bit hollow. We'll get to that right now. In North America lies the heart of the forest, the very first indoor build of Keystone Park. I really like the air conditioning unit we designed for this build. It has pieces from the conservation pack, as well as an actual functioning air unit using a cooler piece to get the mist effect. We're going to be replicating this and bringing it over. This is a pretty large building, so I decided to add 3 of them to actually cool the entire place. I think it looks really nice when they're all functioning together. Now that we have some climate control, let's add in some animals. Despite focusing mainly on the capuchin as well as the Jaguar, we do have 5 exhibits in here. These are for much smaller animals. A majority of the animals inside of the reptile house are from South America, so our options are a little bit limited. The first species that we're going to be adding in is the boa constrictor, and just like in the reptile house videos, once we place the animal in, we get a preset exhibit for it. To make an exhibit animal 100% happy, we have to do 2 things. For one, we have to get its enrichment items in. Typically you would have to research this, but on Sandbox mode you don't. After that's complete, fix the humidity and the temperature. Once the animal is finally at 100% happiness, you can then worry about detailing the build up. You can use various facades on the windows, both 2D and 3D, and mess up the color of the lights. Using all of these tactics 5 times, we were able to make a very nice exhibit for the boa constrictor, Goliath bird eater, Brazilian wandering spider, Amazon giant centipede, and the Titan beetle. I think it's about time we worry about the 6th and by far the largest animal that's going to call this habitat home. I think we should start off with their water requirement. Let's get creative. Like the capuchin have their large climbing enclosure that's the main draw to their exhibit, I really want the Jaguar to be able to have a large waterfall right in the center. This is obviously going to lead to their water requirement, which they need 37 square meters. If you've been playing the game long enough, you can pretty easily visualize 37 square meters. It's relatively large, but also not taking up the entire exhibit. The issue is that we're going to have to make this a lot larger than 37 square meters, mainly because we want to cover the entire thing in foliage. Remember, this is a part of the rainforest. There has to be foliage absolutely everywhere to make it sell the illusion. Once a rough idea of the water was finally in place, I then decided to build up a small mountain behind the waterfall, and to do this, I used a technique that I've never tried before. I used the Add Terrain Cylinder feature and added a bunch of them all over. Now you'll notice that the terrain doesn't necessarily impede the wall or the water. This is by design, otherwise it would get a little bit glitchy and buggy. However, what we can do is build it over it and mess up the elevation. After this was done and we had a large shape, it looks pretty ugly, doesn't it? The way to fix this is to use the Smooth Terrain feature. This blends everything together in a more natural way, making it look like a much more natural mountain. There are obviously prettier ways to build, however I don't think we're going to be able to see a square inch of this dirt once the rocks, foliage, and other things go on top of it, so it's not a problem. Due to the intense amount of foliage that's later going to be added into the habitat, I went with a relatively simple fence from the barrier menu. The only thing I did differently was make sure that it was climb-proof on both sides. I actually like the design better when it's climb-proof anyways, it just looks a little bit more nice with the metal on top. The vision for the habitat now is to make a climbing structure that takes the Jaguar right in front of the waterfall. We've already done a fair amount of rock work in this video, so just know the technique is the exact same. All we're doing now is lining the bottom of the soil to make it look like an actual mountain, instead of just a little overhang. Once the waterfall was lined with the rocks, I decided to work on the climbing structure. I really wanted to double up on these climbing bridges. I can never use them effectively in builds until now. I think the reason this build sells the illusion is because at the end of the day, these are rope bridges. They're not perfectly secure like a bridge you drive a car across. There's a little bit of flex and sag in the middle. Funny enough, this was the hard part. Now all we have to do is build a structure around it. We got the main detail exactly how we wanted it. The climbing structure is rather basic, it's nowhere as intense as the capuchin. While Jaguars are incredibly skilled climbers, they're nowhere near the level of primates. Utilizing only 2 parts, we first added some structural supports to the base of the rope bridge, and then added some additional platforms the Jaguar could go on. Even though it's a lot less complicated than the capuchin, I might actually like this one a little bit more. The best part about it is it's not even done yet, not even close in fact. Now they have 2 hard shelters mixed into the climbing structure. They have a valid reason to go up here. The vision of the habitat is becoming increasingly clear, however I think adding some foliage will really help us all see. Whenever working with foliage, the number 1 rule I typically will go with is always start with the smallest areas first. This is almost always water. The only exceptions off the top of my head I can think of would be the pinnipeds, the sea lion, and the gray seal. The reason I like to break things down into smaller chunks is because it makes the grand sum of the project a lot more manageable. It's the exact same thing we did with the trench. It was a lot easier to work on 5 small trenches separated by those towers that we made instead of one big project. This water is the exact same logic. It's right smack dab in the middle of the entire habitat. Therefore, the left side is a lot smaller now, so is the right side, and so is down the middle. There's 3 distinctive sections, all separated by this water. Another reason why I like doing this is because you can actually differentiate the sections that this water is going to break up. For example, the left and the right side of this habitat are going to be relatively similar, but straight down the middle is going to be more of a rocky coast. Lately, one of my favorite details is adding in these tamarind trees almost as bushes. I sink the trunks really low into the ground and let the various colors of leaves poke through. I really like how they almost have budding flowers attached to them, and I like the look of the general foliage. I added quite a few of these as a general layer. After all of the tamarind trees were in place, I added these coastal mangroves using the exact same technique. I also like these trees because they have roots that go really far down, so if you place the trunk a little bit above, it looks like the roots are poking through the rock and the dirt, which can be realistic. I needed another shade of green. Bramble bushes acted perfectly as a transition between the tamarind trees and the coastal mangrove. I fused them into the rocks. The top of the waterfall, blatantly honest, is kind of a mess. I used pretty much every plant at my disposal. I set the search filter for South and Central America, and if it was green, I placed it down. After I placed a majority of the trees and the larger plants, I was able to focus on the smaller details, like the Swiss cheese plant. The Swiss cheese plant is pretty much crucial in any South America build. I am quite proud of this. However, this is only the backdrop of the exhibit. We still have the entire habitat to detail up. I'm thinking we should work on that rocky coast now. I'm a little bit bored of doing foliage. I can only do so much in one sitting, but after the coast, we'll get back to the rest. Usually I don't do this step until the animal is physically in the habitat, because the traversable area data is incredibly useful when placing enrichment items. If you didn't know, you can specifically filter enrichment items for any animal that you're looking for. Now that we've selected the Jaguar, these are only things that the Jaguar can use. It has basic things like your food trays, but it also has these scratching post trees, which you highlighted in the Zoopedia. I really want to add these, and this is going to be kind of the focal point of this area of the exhibit. I also added a rotation line feeder right in front of the 2 windows on the east side. The last big cat I built for, which was Khan from Asia Quest, really enjoyed this fire hose ball. I figured we'd add this here on the climbing structure to give him some extra incentive to go over there. We'll also add this gift box at the very end. Since technically this is the Jaguar's hard shelter, I thought this would be a really cool idea for some habitat bedding. Cats can't get enough of scratching and rubbing pads, therefore I added one right in front of the water in front of the windows. Lastly, I added a sizable bed for the Jaguar in case the one in the hard shelter is a little bit too small. Getting onto this rocky coast, I decided to use a part that I haven't used in a few episodes now. We used it a ton in the Amazon River portion of South America, however faux rocks have yet to make an appearance in the more realistic rainforest. Making this coast was beyond easy. We realistically just used faux rocks at a variety of different angles. Eventually we did have to change things up and add a little bit of a more realistic gray. I think this acts as a really good transitional rock in between the regular faux rocks that we've been using and the actual real tropical rocks. After an adequate amount of faux rocks had been placed, I added a lot of buffalo grass in little patches. I added a lot of it being dry as a transition into the rocks, but I also made sure to add some alive green versions. I think this habitat has some of the best view and sightlines in Keystone Park. It's tough to say, but this might actually be my favorite, topping the capuchin enclosure by just a hair. The last thing I did on the outside of the building was add in a bunch of different species of moss and vines all over the place. I'm not gonna lie, the footage is pretty bad because I was recording this right as the Frontier Live was happening. In case you missed the announcement, on the console edition sometime next month, we're gonna be getting the Oceania and Eurasia DLC bundle. I'm really excited for that. It has a lot of good animals and a few species that are definitely gonna be making their home either at Keystone Park or our next project. Just because the footage in the recording was pretty poor, doesn't mean the final product slacks in any shape or form. I'm really happy with the overgrown temple look of this entire building, and it's probably my favorite section in Keystone Park in general. The mix of the capuchin habitat going into the Jaguar enclosure is really nice. The only thing left I want to do is detail up the inside just a little bit. We're not going to go crazy in here, just the bare minimum to make it look passable. I'd never seen these butterfly lights before. I'm assuming they emit a pretty... I'd never seen these butterfly lights before. I was a bit disappointed to realize that they didn't have an animation like the ones in the Grassland pack. However, you can't have everything. The South America pack did come first after all. Anyways, I made 2 different designs of the butterflies. Well, realistically I only made 1. I changed one of the colors to be more orange and yellow, and the other one I kept the standard blue. I then scattered them about so the building would have adequate lighting. After that, I added a small TV over every single exhibit and made the image the animal that the exhibit represents. One of the more important details I added in the moment and didn't necessarily have planned were these bamboo trims around the glass. I really like how this looks. It breaks up the monotonous gray and adds a little bit of texture in that blends in with the Jaguar's actual habitat. They use this on their hard shelters. The Jaguar's gonna be here any minute, so I have to hurry with these last details. I used these new pieces that were from the South America pack and scattered them all over the inside of the building, trying to give an artificial rainforest look. The real one's outside though, and the Jaguar's just arriving. Let's get to it. Keystone Park officially has our first big cat. Everyone meet the Jaguar. Pause for the thumbnail. Second pose. The Jaguar must have been incredibly hot upon arriving to the habitat because he spent a fair amount of time in the water. As he explores his habitat, we were able to get incredible views that the guests are going to be able to get in the very next episode, so stay tuned for the official tour of South America. Don't forget, name suggestions are always welcome in the comments, so feel free to leave a comment suggesting a name for our big male Jaguar. A little bit of insider information too. If you give a backstory to the name suggestion, I'm much more likely to pick it. Admittedly, I was a little nervous the Jaguar wouldn't use the climbing structure, however it was closer to the opposite. He absolutely loves pouncing off of this thing. It's really cool. Since he was a bit hot upon arrival and he was stressed from entering a new habitat, we gave him a blood pumpkin. This really worked well and calmed his stress levels down a lot. Between the frozen treats, shelter, and water in the habitat, I'd say the climate regulation is about as close to perfection as you could get. He also seemed to enjoy every single piece of enrichment item. I guess it's true what they say, you give a cat a box and they'll be entertained for days. It was actually incredibly interesting watching the Jaguar explore his habitat. He played with every single enrichment item exactly once. I am incredibly glad we were able to catch a glimpse of him scratching on this tree. It's a really cute animation. Unfortunately, it looks like he's about ready for a nap. We might have to start wrapping up today's episode. If you did make it this far, let me know in the comments. Not many people do. I do hope you enjoyed today's episode, and my apologies for my voice if it sounds scratchy on the recording. I'm a little bit under the weather right now. After a nice break last week, I'm officially back on the grind and ready to pump out as much content as possible. Avoiding burnout is crucial to success after all. I really do think we can make March the most successful month of the channel. We did it in February, and that month only has 28 days. See you guys then. Kingpin out.